Great. I think we should get into things straight away. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar around bias and discrimination in the world of AI. Quite a heavy topic for us to be tackling, but we are joined by a fantastic guest speaker. I will introduce him, one of our finest collaborators. I'll introduce him properly in just a moment. We did ask a question there just at the start in terms of, when you hear the term responsible ethical use of AI, what words particularly spring to mind? Some of the things coming through there, of course, confusion, scariness, discrimination coming through as a big one. We are going to talk about that at length today, actually, in the session today. Difficult, but responsibility, probably a slightly more uplifting word there. For those who haven't met before, my name is Nick. I am the founder and CEO, co-founder and CEO of Edifai Academy, a reasonably new business which focuses really around AI skills training and building AI capabilities within businesses. And we do that largely across these 5 pillars that you see on the screen here. So, of course, from a technical standpoint, when it comes to sort of data and tech stack, but also from a people and culture standpoint, thinking about knowledge and skills. But that last pillar, the one that we're really going to dive into today, is really a little bit more around policies and procedures, which includes things like governance and ethics. And to help us in that conversation, I'm joined by Rahman. Hello. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Nick, thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Sorry.
You want me to introduce myself?
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe kick things off and tell everyone who's with us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in this space.
Okay, so I'm I'm not a fan of talking about myself too much on things like this. I think the only reason to do it is to kind of reassure people that I may know a little bit about what I'm talking about. I know something about this subject, I think a reasonable amount, because I've spent a good few years both working in it and researching, doing research. Currently I work in a couple of universities. I'm in the UK and Germany, where my research interest is discrimination and bias in artificial intelligence. My general subject is ethical AI in business. And that's quite an interesting distinction, because there's all the theoretical stuff, there's the deep technical stuff, but ultimately we're all trying to run businesses, make money, keep our customers satisfied, and all the rest of it. And all of this AI technology is coming in from left field and potentially changing the game to some degree. At another level, it's just another type of technology, and we've been through so many waves depending on how many years we've been working. So I've worked for a number of firms over the years in the HR function, so sort of developing HR software, using it. I've hired people and used the technology, and most recently I've also done a fair amount of work implementing AI technology into businesses. So between all of those, there's a reasonable mix of relevant experience. But what I want to do today is talk about how all of that applies in practice into the HR function. So we're zooming straight into HR. Nick, do you want to mention anything about what we're trying to achieve today?
Yeah, no, I think the point of today's session, and it's going to be a conversation between Roz and I, obviously, we work with a lot of HR professionals, both at Edifai and in its parent company, Co-Team. AI is not a terribly new technology, but obviously the rise of generative AI at the moment is really shaking a lot of businesses up. And I think that was keen to have a conversation with you specifically around the ethical side of it. And as you have rightly put here on the slide, when you bring these 3 things together, what does that even mean? And I'm hoping that we can dig a little bit into that today, as well as give people some advice.
And actually, Nick, you make a good point. What does it mean is I can't think where I want to start off. And the reason I've put this up is because in an hour, I think we've got an hour overall to have this conversation today. I'm not sure how much one can really absorb and learn in practice, because it's a one-time session. We don't necessarily know each other, and it's not prepared like a training course. So I think what's more realistic, and we can debate that later if people want to do more, what's realistic is to get some pointers on what are the things that we need to know about and find out about if we're using AI, we want to use it ethically and we're in the HR function. And perhaps more importantly, as a result of the things that we find out about, what should we be doing? What are the actions? And the reason why I want to start with meaning is because whenever I've talked to people about anything related to this, the problem often is we mean different things by basic words like ethics and to some extent even HR. So I want to kick off, if you want to move on to the next slide, Nick, by talking about the meaning of some of these concepts. And we'll do that for a little while. I am intending to skip through this reasonably fast because I want to lose much time at the end. Nick, if you want to talk about the format and how we're going to use the time, please.
Yeah, fantastic. So we have a live Q&A, of course. During this, you can access that just off your Zoom toolbar at the Q&A function. If you submit questions there, they will be anonymized. We will pick those up towards the end of the session. We are discussing some pretty big topics here today, so I hope that a lot of questions will come in and really try to make the most of the expertise that we have in the room. But as you said, I guess, let's start by first even defining what is AI in this context.
So just a brief comment on the Q&A and the format. One of the reasons I like things like webinars is because they can be more interactive than a regular conference session. So I can't see the questions and the comments, Nick, you're, I think, seeing what people are tapping in as we're watching. But if anyone wants me to slow down, speed up, stop and talk about something, I think if they get a message to you somehow, Nick, by putting a hand up or sending in a comment, we can be flexible. If we end up spending more time talking now, we can shorten things later or vice versa. Are you okay with that, Nick?
That's perfect. Yeah, I'll pick up the questions as they come in. So please definitely use that function as we move throughout the session.
So we're talking about three things: artificial intelligence, obviously; bias and discrimination, obviously; ethics, and in particular ethics in business. Now, the work I do in Germany at the University of Bonn is actually part of the Department of Philosophy, which kind of is interesting for me from a business perspective, because sometimes it feels quite ethereal. But the point is, some of those quite theoretical concepts of what do we mean by ethical, we forget about them. We don't talk about them often enough. And it's when you put them into the practical reality of doing business and you see the conflicts that arise, that's where it becomes interesting. And so ethics in business is what I want to talk about. And we're doing this very narrowly in the context of HR, because it applies in different ways to different topics. So if we move on, we can get on to the start. So let's start with artificial intelligence. You can do your Google searches, read your books, and there'll be loads and loads of definitions, all of them valid, and all mean different things depending on what your perspective is. For me, for this subject, for this audience, I think we want to keep it relatively high level and non-technical. We're talking about computer systems. That's something to bear in mind. Actually, artificial intelligence can mean other things like robots and self-driving cars. But here we're talking about computer systems that we use in the HR function. We're talking about computer systems that behave in a way that we describe as intelligently. But what that means, again, is a subject of debate, and I'll move on to that in a second. But the key point about the supposed intelligence that AI shows is that it's based on the computer system learning and using huge amounts of data. And that's something that hopefully all of us at least know that that's the case, even if we don't necessarily know what it means. To put it into context, the kind of tasks we're talking about in HR. So what kind of things are we using AI for? Begin with, as Nick said, AI has been around for a while. So everyday work like email, word processing, spreadsheets, full of AI already. Simple things like the spell check, the grammar checks, they're already there. They've been up and running. I'm sure we're all familiar with the fact that email now seems to be having someone over our shoulder reading our emails and reminding us whether we've forgotten an attachment or there's an email that we should be replying to that we haven't. Even adverts, if you're using some of the free email systems based on what you're typing about, writing about. So it's built in already. We're also familiar with intelligent computer systems that personalize and target. And so when it comes to the HR function, the moment you want to advertise a position and put it on LinkedIn or a job board, there's plenty of AI going in without you necessarily doing anything other than saying who's your target audience. And even if you don't, the systems nowadays will take a look at what your job spec is talking about and will start to target and personalize ads accordingly. We've probably all seen the different ends of that. So again, using LinkedIn as a good example, the kind of things that you see in your feed are personalized to you. And it's not simply because there's a set of rules, it's because there's artificial intelligence constantly adapting and learning based on what you're doing. So there's the kind of regular AI, if you like. There's more specialized stuff around AI, HR, screening CVs, analyzing interview results, looking at performance appraisals nowadays, calculating bonuses, even fairly mundane things like T&E, travel and expense management. There's a lot of artificial intelligence used with things like the simple act of scanning your receipts on your phone and getting them uploaded, automatically categorized. A lot of that stuff counts as AI. So that's there. But I think the stuff that gets the headlines is the more cutting edge things. So there's monitoring going on in lots of organizations around, whether it's keyboard monitoring and the keystrokes, whether it's cameras, whether it's actually, some of you have probably read about software that is meant to be able to look at what's happening in an interview through a camera and analyzing the facial expressions and giving you some insights on the candidate's personality. That's fairly cutting edge. Whether it's good or not is a debate we'll be having in a moment, I'm sure. Planning skills, looking at your diversity and equality policies, whether they're working. There's plenty of work going on providing mental health support, and there are some quite advanced uses of AI to do online counseling, in effect, not just a person on the other end of a video call, but a computer trying to figure some of that out. And so what we mean is computers that apply things that we would consider human judgment, computers that can do very complex data analysis, computers that can try and answer questions about why, looking at root cause analysis, predicting some form of what's going to happen in the future. That's the kind of intelligence. And it's all based on data about people mixed with data from the business, and also external data such as demographics, what's going on in the population at large. And the data about people both is from inside your organization, your current employees, your past employees, but in the case of, let's say, HR packages, a lot of the work is done by looking at people data from other organizations. And one of the key things to remember about artificial intelligence is the intelligence is created by the system doing what's called training. It looks for patterns in these massive amounts of data and tries to figure out some logic that then gets applied to the problem you're trying to solve. In a nutshell, that's what we're talking about in HR. Nick,
yeah, I just want to pick up on that training point a little bit there, because I think that's, particularly if you look at, ChatGPT seems to, and OpenAI seems to be stealing the news right now, but also a lot of the other large language models out there, and a lot of discussion about the data that they've been trained on.
Exactly.
Whether that's publicly available or whether it's, had access to people's private records. And as we're going to explore in this webinar, also some of the issues that can happen when the AI is trained on a data set that might already have bias in it. So I think.
So let me just add a point to that. It leads to something that's quite fundamental in this. The data we're talking about is used. It applies in two situations. There's the training of the AI before the system comes anywhere near your business and your computer. Someone somewhere has been training it by feeding it huge amounts of data, and it works out some rules, some behaviors, some logic. And that's built into something called an algorithm. Then when it arrives on your desk, it's pre-trained, and that training data is no longer something that you're particularly going to see anyway. You see the results of that training data. It then works on the data that you're giving it to do with your organization. And that's a different set of data. So there's the data it continues to use in the future, and it will keep changing what it's doing based on that data. But there's the historic training data, and it's something that you often are unaware of because it was done well before you received the software. And probably it's worth us moving on, because that's where we get onto some of the other topics.
Yeah, no problems. That classic thing that your input could be the next person's output, I think is the key.
So when we talk about ethics in business, in a nutshell, doing something ethically means doing the right thing, whatever that means. And that's where it becomes an issue. Generally, doing the right thing isn't a problem most of the time because it's kind of obvious. It's only when you get into gray areas, when you get contention, when you get arguments about right and wrong or trade-offs between the right thing and the commercially more lucrative thing. And so generally, legal compliance is the bare minimum for being ethical. The question that arises in a lot of people's minds is it enough? If I can sit there and say the use of AI that I'm applying is following the law, I'm monitoring my employees with cameras, but I'm following GDPR, I'm telling them that I'm doing it, and they've got some sort of choice. Is that okay? Is that enough? Then there's a question of doing what's acceptable. And when we say acceptable, that's usually around business rules, it's around cultural norms. But those rules and norms, we're not necessarily prescribing those or defining those. They tend to evolve. And so if I go back to when I first started work in an investment bank many years ago, the kind of behavior that went on day to day, particularly around the way women, female employees were treated, ethnic minorities, the kind of macho-ness that would now we'd call bullying. In those days, it was completely acceptable. Nowadays, it's not. And so acceptable and ethical are kind of synonyms, but it's quite hard to define. And so we use rules, which might be laws, policies, codes of conducts, and those tend to be our guidelines. But again, those rules are often not done in terms of what's the right thing to do. It's what's appropriate. It's what's best for the business. And the final thing to think about is if those rules are broken, if people behave unacceptably, and in the extreme case, if we're not following the law, how does our organization know? How do we check and how do we enforce? So there are reviews, there might be tests. Nowadays, increasingly, people talk about audits of the ethics of the AI. Ultimately, a lot of the time, it's only when someone complains or there's a whistleblower or a legal case that we really find out. And so it's one thing to talk about doing the right thing. It's another thing to know whether we can check it and enforce it.
And then I guess we should talk a little bit around this bias and discrimination circle, as part of the Venn diagram.
Yeah, so bias and discrimination is pretty much everything we just said. Are we doing the right thing? Is it legally compliant, and is that enough? What are the cultural and organizational norms, and what do we do if we're breaking some of those? How do we know that we're not doing the right thing? And specifically around bias and discrimination, depending on where your organization is based, there are different laws that will define what we're talking about. So the specific ethical question on bias and discrimination is someone being treated differently by their organization because of some personal characteristics, the obvious ones being gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And as I say, different laws will define different lists. In the UK, we've got the protected characteristics that are in standard employment law. One obvious question is that enough? And there are certain loopholes that we're more or less sorting out. But not that long ago in the US, you could be in trouble if you discriminated against someone because they were female. You could do the same thing if they were black, or if they were being discriminated against because of age. But if it was all three or two of those three, there was an actual loophole where the law didn't quite work. I think that's been fixed, but there are questions where lawyers can come in and help with some of those. But the point is, the law defines what we mean by different treatment, and generally, it only matters if some harm is done. In other words, if you treat someone differently, but they can't prove that something bad happened to them as a result, legally, that's okay. But ethically, is it? Those are the sorts of issues in HR that speak to the culture we're talking about. And ultimately, businesses care about this for all sorts of reasons. But most businesses are there. Most business leaders are measured on business performance, which is generally financial. And so bias, discrimination, and other ethical factors are done in the context of needing to make money. And if there's a trade-off between the two, that's where the role of HR becomes kind of interesting, because often you're swimming against the tide if there's a business cost that needs to be paid.
Yeah,
anything you want to add to that, Nick?
No, I think, I mean, that overlap there between ethics and bias, we for some people on this webinar may have been in the session we ran last week on just general DEI and the use of pronouns in the workplace and how they can be used in a discriminatory way. I'm probably familiar with the conversation we were having last week. I guess that crossover there is kind of obvious to me. It's the AI coming in on top of that, I think, is where it really starts to become quite complicated. So yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts around that, Ross.
And that's actually the crux of it. So if you take any of the three areas, if you want to use AI in HR, it's difficult, it's complex, and there are lots of things we need to worry about. If you want to make sure that your organization is behaving ethically, and as an HR professional, the policies, the actions, the processes, the new things you're trying to do are ethical, that's not straightforward. And you're often into difficult territory if you want to take a stand. If you want to do something about bias and discrimination, people have been trying to do something about that for centuries and more recently decades, and we still haven't figured out how to eradicate it, even to get everyone to acknowledge it's a problem. Any one of those by themselves is tough. Overlap two of them and you're into even more difficulty. The combination of all three, being ethical, particularly around bias and discrimination, as we introduce AI into the HR function, is incredibly complex. And I think it's really easy for people to just jump straight into the next shiny new thing because someone has said this is what you have to do. Or perhaps you don't even have a choice. It's just built into some software that you're having to use. There are two things to be aware of, two guiding principles that take us through the complexity, and hanging on to those will, I think, deal with most of the challenges, certainly the first order challenges, the most difficult ones. First and foremost, what most people are familiar with, at least in principle, is that the training data that we use in HR systems is a reflection of people data that goes back years over many, many people. That data is picked up from times when we may not have been behaving the way we'd like to behave today. Organizations that have historically had a gender bias in their hiring, people that have rewarded a particular type of very aggressive behavior, folks that have used qualifications that will lead them towards graduates, Oxbridge people from public schools or whatever it might be. Those sorts of patterns are built into historic data. And if we simply take that data and use it to train the AI, what we're teaching it is those bad habits. And that's fairly fundamental. The historic data that is used to train AI is where many of these problems arise. Now, that's not news. Most people have seen it. If the number of times I go up to people and ask them to talk about this topic, and the first thing they say is, oh, it's in the historic data, we fix that. But when you ask them how they fixed it, they refer you to IT or to their vendor. And I'm not sure too many people know how it gets fixed. Part of the challenge for using technology, AI technology in an HR function, is it's often given to you pre-trained. And that training data may or may not be fixed. So the sorts of things that the people that build AI systems should be doing is taking the historic data and looking for patterns that demonstrate discrimination and adjusting the data. They can play around with the data to strip out some of the things that are indicators of what's going on. They can add new data, what's called synthetic data. You can create extra data that is dummy data, if you like, that increases the representation. And so it's not just the historic data, it's the representativeness of the data. Is the data that you're using to train the AI representative of the people that you want to use to represent the community that you're after, particularly in things like recruitment, but also in performance management and all the other things that go on in HR. So data is what it's all about for one of the biggest areas of complexity. Understanding whether it's okay, whether it's not okay, what's been done about it is the thread that we're going to start pulling on over the next couple of slides. The second thing is the logic. I might have mentioned the word algorithm earlier. It's it's a slightly complex sounding word that simply means the logic, the programming. It's a modern version of the computer program. The reason why it's called an algorithm is because it's not really programmed by people. It's done in a different way technically, and it represents logic, often mathematical and statistical logic, and it's generated by the AI system learning during the training how to get the results that you're looking for. Now, the reason I picked that out is because the way it's done, you can't look at a specification. It's not like the old days where you can look at the code or you could look at what the spec was that the programmers used. It doesn't work in the way that old systems used to, where you have a set of requirements and someone is trying to meet those requirements. It tends to be generated during a reasonably opaque training process. And as a result, if no one makes the effort, once you get the algorithm and it starts getting to work, you can't trace back how the answer was generated in most of the time. Certainly, it's not an automatic thing that you can do. And so concepts like transparency and explainability are ways in which you build AI so that it's clear how the different results were created. You build in a layer of showing the workings, if you like. And explainability is trying to trap the points in the process where decisions were made. So you might have transparent algorithms, but you still can't quite get an explanation of why one candidate was seen as more attractive than another. An explainable AI system gives you the answer to the question, why did that decision get made? Those are the two big issues that if we can get on top of those in HR as users of AI, you're probably going to address most of the problems that we'll talk about, that you'll see and that you'll be at risk. And the rest of this, the words that I want to talk about are how you get to those two areas and the sorts of things you can do about it. Nick, anything you want to add? Anything from the audience while we're at this stage?
Yeah, no questions have come in yet. So once again, if you would like to ask a question off your Zoom bar, you should be able to access the Q&A tab, which you can submit a question through, and we'll watch those as they pop up. I mean, the obvious thing here is like there's a lot of complexity, sort of almost why bother, is the inevitable question was. So like if it's so difficult to be doing this, I mean, surely the benefits have to outweigh the cons. So should we have a bit of a chat about some of the...
Just in one moment, before we move on, that's exactly what we want to do next. If anyone in the audience feels like contributing, it's not so much questions, but what I'm curious about is whether the two things that I've put on this slide are news, whether people kind of know that and they just need to know more about what to do about it, or whether that in itself is new knowledge. And so if anyone feels like adding a chat message, just giving their response to the fact that these are the two big things to worry about and to do something about, I'd be kind of curious. But yeah, let's move on to why you bother, because it's, I think, the key to this. Like any business decision, any investment, it's only worth it if the benefits outweigh the costs and the risk. And the thing about HR AI is the benefits potentially are just huge. But those benefits don't necessarily apply to all of the people that we might want it to apply to. So, for example, one of the biggest drivers of businesses, CFOs being happy to invest in AI technology for the HR function is because it allows HR operations to be done faster and cheaper. Now, faster and cheaper isn't necessarily better, but faster and cheaper is often a really good reason for lots of decisions in business. Faster, cheaper means getting through a whole load of CVs when you're assessing them faster than a person could. Cheaper means sending out targeted job adverts, and instead of worrying too much about investing a huge amount in marketing, using AI to make sure that you get far more responses. You can also look at some of the operations on things like, as I mentioned, travel and expenses, time reporting. Some of those things, you simply end up with more throughput and therefore a need for fewer people. And you certainly get more outputs for the same amount of money. For HR professionals, that's a mixed blessing, because as long as doing faster, cheaper means the same teams are available to do other things, and you can increase the quality of, let's say, your recruitment, that's a really good thing. But if the benefits are being measured by a CFO who's interested in reducing the bottom line of the organization, that can also lead to needing smaller HR teams. Now, maybe that's a reality that we have to get used to. Maybe that's something where a discussion is needed about, do we just want faster, cheaper, or do we want to move to the second thing, which is better? Now, better means higher quality. And obviously, I don't need to preach to HR professionals that if you do better quality recruitment, people management, performance assessment, incentives measurement, etc., if you do that better, your people perform better, they stay longer, you have lower recruitment costs, you have better retention, huge benefits. But unless you're able to demonstrate those benefits, then the faster, cheaper bit tends to outweigh things when it comes to the guys making the decisions about the finance. Better typically means using the AI to analyze the information you've got about candidates, about HR activities, about people performance, and come up with more accurate assessments of who's doing well, who's not doing well. More interestingly, it's not just who's doing well and who's not doing well, but why. Why is there a problem, and what can we do about it? So a big part of AI in a topic called people analytics or evidence-based HR you might be familiar with is figuring out the answers to the why questions, not just the what questions, and trying to forecast and predict what's going to happen so that we can preempt them. And in the best case, better HR means, if you use AI effectively, getting insights on what to do about patterns that you see in people performance. And then there's the third area, which is new answers to questions that we didn't necessarily know we could address without without AI. We couldn't. Many organizations look at their EDI policies and they've got their regular monitoring activities that go on. But there are possibilities of using AI to do something around measuring and monitoring EDI in real time as we're going through the activities. Very embryonic, a lot of it's still very debatable because the science isn't necessarily clear. And that's just one example. When it comes to things like employee well-being, I think there's a lot that we can look at in terms of, can AI start to analyze people's performance and answer questions about what's going on, and are there issues that we previously wouldn't even look at considering in terms of their well-being. And so there are new tools, new answers that we can also look at. Unfortunately, if you balance the benefits against the risks, if we remind ourselves of what was on the previous slides, doing this wrong can lead to all sorts of issues. And some of the issues are things that we can talk about in a moment. But the point is, balancing those risks is something that it's not usually down to someone who's got the employee's well-being at the heart of the decision. It's balanced against the commercial reality, other business benefits, costs, etc. And so these sorts of these two areas, if we then move forward again, Nick, to the other slide, need to be balanced against all three. The people making those balancing judgments often pay more attention to what they're going to get than what could go wrong.
Mm. Some super interesting insights in there, and I often think, we talk a lot about this in many of our programs at Edifai, but that AI is inevitably in most functions going to make things more efficient and faster and cheaper to deliver. But those other two that you speak about, like new solutions and can we make things better, where we put the human touch, I still think is such a crucial part of this. So some interesting insight. We have actually sort of been flooded with questions in the time that you've been talking there, was. So I do want to just jump back to this. I'm going to pick up a question first of all.
Yeah.
So I'd agree these two things are the biggest areas of concern in approaching AI for us, and subsequently being able already to have internal processes that can accommodate for these concerns. would love to hear some more recommendations on how we can build some of this thought into assessment criteria of AI tools to help in that filtering process for making the decisions on which tools to use.
Okay, that preempts it's a wonderful segue to some of the stuff that's coming, not the next slide that we're going to do, but the one after. So I'll keep my powder dry on that one, but that's exactly one of the things I want to talk about in a couple of minutes. Any other questions?
A couple of others that came on off this. Is there any way you could use AI to potentially analyze and overcome bias in the data sets that it's being fed?
Absolutely. And that's the point. If you talk to the data scientists that are building AI, if you talk to the vendors that are selling you the AI, they will tell you that they've got wonderful software that scans the data and it makes it fair. It creates fair data sets. And maybe they're right. But the point is, you have to trust them and believe them, because very rarely do they show you how. And if they do, you usually need some sort of masters in statistics to understand, because it's expressed in mathematical terms or linear algebra. It may well be right, but the IT market for developers is flooded with so-called fairness toolkits. And the core purpose of them is to look at data and to try and make it representative and to try and take out fairness. And so there are lots of things in developers' tool sets. There are lots of tools that your IT teams should be using or your vendors should be using, where as they're developing their software, as they're training the AI, they should be running those tools against the training data to make sure they're not building bias in. My point is, you're trusting them to do that. So absolutely the right question. Brilliant. And the answer that people will tell you that are selling you the stuff is they do it. But I've read so many papers where I question the science on some of them. On others, I can see flaws because they're basing their logic on the law. There are others where it's a statistical definition of fairness, which may be relevant, but it's not tested against the business use. And so there's a lot of debate. There are whole conferences on fairness algorithms to I can't even think of the word, to take out the unrepresentative data in a training data set. It's big business.
Okay. There's another question that's actually not too dissimilar to that, and potentially answered, but what are the best examples of anti-bias features you've seen in AI tools? So I think you've covered majority of those. Was there anything else that comes to mind?
You can run reports on some tools. And again, this sits somewhere between the user and the technology team. And I think you can run reports that talk about the representativeness of the data that was used. And this is part of the explainability. So I guess the point is, if you're asking for explainable answers, then part of that explanation should be the logic that was used. Part of it should be justifying that the data that was used for the decision or the training was representative. Those tools exist, and they may be part of the HR packages that you're using. They're more likely to be bolt-ons. They often sit as part of the kind of the data and analytics part of an organization. And it may be that the skills required to validate whether that's correct sit more in a technology department than an end user organization. And so having a bunch of technical folks or statistically trained folks that are your friends, that are representing what you want and helping you translate and understand is part of it, I think.
Brilliant. There are some other good questions in here, but I'm going to hold on these questions because I know that we're going to address them a little bit in the content we've got.
We've got about 15 minutes to go, so let's skip through the last couple because I think they cover a lot of what's going on. So the point is, a lot of the issues that you face in HR are actually symptoms of broader issues around the use of AI. So what I think has already been referred to both in the questions and in my comments, finding appropriate, reliable data to train HR AI or any AI is a big question. It's potentially an issue. Confirming that it was appropriate and reliable is actually the bigger issue for me. There's this concept of data privacy. Hopefully we all understand GDPR and we understand how it applies to people data. The big thing to remember about HR is that we're dealing with people data. Unlike any other data in business, It doesn't belong to the business. The people data belongs to the people. Now, we know that with customer data. I think we've been fined enough to know that it belongs to the customers. Employee data belongs to employees. And so that's fine when it comes to an HR system. Hopefully the HR teams are all so aware of that, they understand and respect it. But you've got folks in sales and operations that are monitoring their employees, their teams, for how well they're working, whether they're hitting their sales targets. You've got security guys taking pictures, and that's going into AI systems. There's people data in that as well. And I don't necessarily know that people that are in other departments, colleagues of HR folks, necessarily understand the distinction between data privacy for people data and other data. They understand the legal requirements, I'm sure, but do they get that it's not their data to use? It's a privilege they've been allowed to have that data. Understanding the science, we've talked about that a lot. There's so much science that is going on. I saw this morning an app that was being advertised, which allows you to translate a baby screaming. If a baby's crying, you record it, and this app will tell you what the baby means. It can't work. It's just crazy. But they tell you there's science. And when you look, they presented a paper at a conference and published it. All that paper said is they've done it. It had no science behind it at all. Knowing who's really responsible and accountable for people data, the point I'd make on this is that if a company has a breach of its financial data, you can be pretty sure that the guys in finance or the folks in finance will not be saying it was the IT guy's fault. They will have all sorts of checks and balances to make sure that they're in control of the finance data, because they really are responsible for it. If there's a breach and it goes wrong, it's finance guys that will be in trouble. I don't know how many HR folks really feel like they're in control of their people data. And if there are breaches, all too often people say it was the IT guys. I'm not sure what the reality should be and is. Finally, the shiny new things. A lot of the time, as we're finding with ChatGPT, everyone sits there and says, this stuff is great, you ought to use it. We find out later that maybe that wasn't the case. And AI, particularly in HR, someone comes along and says there's this really cool new tool that uses AI to make sure that you can find employees that are struggling. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but it's kind of quite sensitive stuff. But if everyone's using it, if everyone's using AI to record their interviews and decide who's the most successful candidate, if everyone's using it, it doesn't mean it's okay to use it. And there's a lot of that going on with the systems around at the moment.
Yeah, I would really second that as well. And that Empress New Clothes piece, having worked in digital transformation broadly myself for 15 years, seeing companies and people jump on things because they're new and they're shiny, without really any consideration of the consequences or whether anyone even really gives a shit about it, type thing.
So the point of putting these up is not to make it look scary, because actually it isn't. It's about being informed on what to do about it. Otherwise, it's one big nebulous problem that you can't disentangle the pieces. These are the sorts of things that we need to do something about. But what to do about it is conceptually, in principle, it's not that difficult. The devil is always in the detail. And if we move on to the next slide, we can talk about that. For me, the key to the kind of people watching this session, taking part in this, is to look past the AI and hang on to the business sense, because all we're doing is the same kind of HR that we've been doing for a while, and we're trying to do it as well. And the HR hasn't changed. The things that we're trying to do haven't really changed. The tools are trying to do things differently, but the underlying tasks are the same. Therefore, three things. Asking the tough questions about the underlying basics, particularly about the data and logic, being a real pain. I want to understand how this stuff works. I want to understand where you got the data from and how you know that that decision it made to give me these 5 candidates as the top of a list of 20, as opposed to those 5. How did it get decided? And unless your vendor or your IT department or whoever else is telling you to use it can explain it in ways that you're comfortable with, then keep asking. I think that is one of the biggest problems that we face in business, that too often we just accept because it's seductive, particularly if someone is sitting, breathing down our neck saying, this stuff is going to make everything so much cheaper. Look how much budget we're going to save. Look how many more CVs we can screen. Someone has to stand up and ask the tough questions and be really dogged about it, in my opinion. Secondly, we've got lots of policies and controls to make sure that HR activities and any activities that impinge on our people, to make sure they work. But they were designed in a world where most of the decisions were made by people using judgment, and the data was always considered and was used with judgment, with an opportunity to pause. And there were opportunities to go back and double check if something wasn't right. And it meant things were a bit slower, but to do the right thing, that's what you needed to do. Now that things skip through in microseconds, now that a system gives you a result that previously you needed people to look at, now that there's no opportunity to double check something because it's already gone through to the next stage of the workflow, how have the policies and controls been modified? What's happened to the checklists? What are the audits looking at? What reports do we get? And how do you test some of these things? Modifying the existing controls, as opposed to saying, let's do something just for AI, modifying what already works to allow for AI. And finally, this thing about being dogged, if you don't understand what something's doing, being able to say, I won't accept that functionality is a tough call. But I think until those tough calls are made, there's no pressure on the vendors and the IT folks to take seriously the questions that they should be being asked. It's not that they don't want to, but if people are too willing to buy too easily and they're going to wait until it goes wrong to figure it out and fix it, then I think there's a trick we're missing. This is tough. It really is tough, especially for HR, because a lot of the folks that you'll be debating this with, arguing with, will find those benefits more seductive, shall we say, or they might be less concerned about the risks, because it's not like this is new. HR talking about something that's going to be the wrong thing isn't necessarily a voice that gets listened to, because other people are worried about other aspects of the business, primarily the money.
Mm. Some interesting thoughts there, and hopefully picks up that question from earlier on, in terms of some practical, tangible, pragmatic steps to take.
Yeah, so putting those into practice, there's detail, but the detail depends so much on, have you just received an upgrade to your in-house HR system? Let's say you're using one of these end-to-end packages. A lot of the time they're full of AI, and you might get new releases. Those new releases will be the things that you need to be asking about. Maybe there's something that I think a lot of the time the way this works, someone comes to you and says, here's a package that we're going to be trialing for such and such an activity, let's say some part of recruitment. That's the point at which the questions need to get asked. If it's already been decided, then it's a slightly different discussion. And then the question is, why weren't you involved earlier on and given the opportunity to ask these questions? Who in the HR line should be asking these questions? But that's why the specifics vary so much. If your own in-house team are building tools for you, then it should be easier because you're part of that process, hopefully.
Yeah. So let's just talk then a little bit, I think, to sort of round this out, just around change.
Yeah, because I want to close with something that we've been talking around without necessarily taking head on. One of the things that HR has always done is helped employees deal with change, whether it's outsourcing, whether it's the automation of tasks, whether it's people on the factory floor dealing with new technology. Helping people deal with change is what HR does. But I don't know if HR is treating itself the way it would treat any other employees about this fundamental change that's happening to it. AI is, if not already, it will be a fundamental part of the 21st century HR profession, which means a new relationship with data based on very different forms of technology to anything that we've used before. And unfortunately, that means there are new skills and responsibilities which aren't necessarily that welcome to certainly some of the HR folks I know, because crucially, it means understanding numbers, being comfortable with statistics, being able to use analytics tools and do analytics. That's not necessarily a core skill set of a lot of HR folks. And when they came into the profession, it wasn't necessarily what they wanted to do. if that's part of the new HR profession, what does it mean? And then finally, if you've been around for a while, you know how to solve problems the old way. Now you've got new problems and new ways of dealing with old problems. That's a very human change. And just like any other part of the workforce, dealing with that is uncomfortable. Part of HR's response to AI is dealing with the human side of change, but on itself, not just the rest of the workforce.
We just have a question. It came a little earlier, but I wanted to hold back on it because I think we wanted to get through some of this. And oddly, it's quite specific, but do you have any advice for helping us to stress the importance of ethics to leadership? So I think many of our senior management sees the immediate benefits and are blind to the risks of ethics. And that's a big question to tackle.
Yeah, but come on. I mean, that's nothing to do with AI. It's nothing to do with HR. If you're in a business where your leaders struggle to engage in a conversation about ethics,
maybe not.
Is that the kind of company you want to work for? Are those the people you want to work with? If you're able to engage with them and persuade them, just like any other person that you talk to, about the value of being more ethical, whatever that means, great. That's what we do with all of our colleagues, particularly our bosses. If they're closed-minded about it, there are probably bigger questions about the organization you're in. Maybe it's about learning to accept that that's the organization you're in. It could be there's nothing we can do about it, but learning to accept it is perhaps another approach to this. But I think that's a much bigger question. I don't know if that's something that's specific to this conversation.
We also had a more specific question come in talking about D&I strategy, or EDI, whatever you want to call it. Are there any specific ways that you could immediately start leveraging AI practically? What could I do right now?
So that's a really interesting one, because as long as you have data in your organization that allows you to identify patterns to do with DEI, so gender, ethnicity, whatever it might be, if you have the data, then there's lots that very simple AI can do. It's part of it's a subset of people analytics. There are tools out there that will allow you to monitor all sorts of things about your workforce. You can split by these different characteristics. The issue is some of this, well, most of this stuff you're not allowed to capture, so it has to be voluntary. But more importantly, if you're trying to remove discrimination in things like interviewing, a lot of the time what people will do is strip out identifiers that will allude to things like any of the protected characteristics. You strip out gender, date of birth, whatever it might be, maybe change names so that you can't tell from a name if there's an ethnicity in play or something like that. The point is, if you've removed that data, your people analytics and your AI can't monitor it and can't analyze it. So there's a question about whether you can persuade your employees to volunteer the information, which they'll only do if they trust you to use it properly. So at the heart of all of this EDI strategy, can you identify the data that you need to implement such a strategy, such a policy? If you can't, then there's much more to do around education and training, because until employees are willing to share that data about themselves, the tools can't do very much. It's a really difficult question. So for me, education and awareness, not just about the standard stuff, how to behave, et cetera, et cetera. It's the importance of having the data and reassurance that it's okay to share it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But I think until we've got to the stage where we have the data, there's a limit to what AI can do about this.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to asking the right questions.
Sure.
So just keep that curious mindset and just ask questions and accept things as they are, and have maybe some of the slightly uncomfortable conversations. We've only got sort of 1 minute left. We had some questions submitted free. I think in some ways we've sort of covered a lot of what's come in there. There was one very specific question I just want to quickly get your perspective on, which is more around sort of advertising, marketing. So apart from human editing, are there other ways to make like D&I as a default when applying AI to advertising? And I just wanted to throw this one at the end because it's nothing to do necessarily with HR. But I think it's also just it'd be interesting to get your perspective on it.
I think this is very relevant to HR in the sense that I don't think there's any such thing as applying AI to advertising with diversity and inclusion. It's diversity and inclusion in advertising. And then the AI should be automating or adding intelligence to a function or an activity that already embraces diversity and inclusion. But if you're being, I don't know, you're targeting an ethnic minority with your campaigns, if you're forgetting that by looking at certain customer characteristics when you're looking at your target audience, you're automatically excluding certain postcodes and therefore you're moving to mostly white middle class, whatever it might be. That's nothing to do with AI. That's your advertising. The AI will be used to answer the questions such as, where do I find the most likely people to buy? Where do I find people that have got the most spending power? You ask those questions with or without AI, you run into risks of falling over diversity and inclusion issues, which hopefully, well, if you're not aware of those and you're not building those in, your advertising needs to rethink the importance of diversity and inclusion. It's not built in, it's not default. HR is not that different. It's just that HR folks are so much more aware of this that it tends not to happen in the HR function itself. It's the technology.
Brilliant. On that note, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
Absolutely loaded with like fantastic sort of insights, tips, and questions people can go and start asking around the integration of these tools, what the tools can do, but also some of the potential sort of pitfalls there. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I'm on the tip of a very big iceberg.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. And thank you for everyone who did join us today. We'll see you in our next series of webinars.
See ya.
Bye for now. Thank you.